12, after her own mother died. As the eldest daughter, it was her responsibility to take care of her younger siblings. Consequently, she never learned more than basic reading and math, and although she married and had kids of her own, she worked outside the home to add a household income, often doing cleaning and other low-wage work. Of her own children, most were reasonable people, but her youngest daughter was a complete parasite. She had no problem taking whatever she could from her mother, my grandmother, even having her mother co-sign on debts and then leaving her to pay for it. Despite not having much education, my grandmother was a wise person in her own way, but not when it came to her own kids, and especially not her mooch daughter. She just couldn't stop letting her daughter misuse her. She ultimately became ill with cancer. Her kids took care of her, except for, you guessed it, the youngest parasite daughter. On her deathbed, she told her oldest daughter she was worried about the mooch, and related where she kept all her money. It wasn't much, maybe $700 or so. And then she told her oldest daughter that when she died, to give it all to the mooch. After my grandmother died, the oldest daughter had to stomach giving her own mother's last dollars to her miserable vampire sister. But to make it more tolerable, she decided to do it by sending it in installments of $10 a month. So that's what she did for years, just $10 a month every month. Not enough to splurge on anything, and not even enough to make a difference in her life. Almost as if it were mine. I always admired my older aunt. She knew how to hold a grudge. Mooch more or less continued in her old ways, trying to coast off her siblings, but was not very successful. She got my father to co-sign for a credit card or loan or something, and left him with $10K in debt. After that, he cut her off totally. She went on in her incredibly low-life way, always going from one skeezy guy to another. I hate to think that I have any genes in common with her. On the other hand, I have genes in common with an older sister too, and that is something I treasure. She was my godmother too, so bonus. Is she a jerk for what she did to her younger sister? Well, kind of a jerk move. Honestly, making sure that Grandma's savings went to the mooch like that was a petty move that didn't net her any sort of benefit. But in a weird way, I think it was probably a positive influence on the mooch's life. She can't make any big ridiculous purchases with that money, and likely would have stopped registering it going into her account. So these tiny little transactions were as likely to end up being spent on little things like groceries as much as anything else. So your aunt may have unwittingly helped Grandma's wishes by ensuring that the mooch used the money to actually take care of herself now and then. Not that it sounds like she would have appreciated it. I wish I knew of a way for people like your serial leech of an aunt to better themselves. But I really only hear about people like her mending her ways after they hit rock bottom. Is this a problem that can be fixed any other way that people know of? Intervention, maybe? Want me to log my work time more accurately using a timer because you think I'm cheating you? Okay, happy to oblige. This happened a while ago and I've since moved jobs. Basically, every employee in my department was supposed to log work hours and the project they were working on. When I first joined the company, I noticed that there was an inbuilt timer in the software which you could start or stop to get accurate logs. But I asked my bosses and other employees around, and everyone told me that no one uses it, and everyone fills in the log EOD or first thing in the morning next day. I was cool with that. So I started logging my time just like everyone else. Things were fine for quite a while, till I started putting in more and more hours to get work done. Fast forward to that fateful day where I got called in by management. They told me that my logging seems dishonest and deliberately misleading. I got told off, saying that they rely on these numbers to plan deadlines for the future, only on paper, not in practice, and that I was apparently cheating the company. They instructed me to only use the timer next day on and nothing else. I should probably mention that the way I logged time till then was rounded down to 30-minute increments, just out of personal preference. For example, if a meeting lasted 45 minutes, I'd more often than not log 30 minutes. On top of that, I used to remove an hour off the top just as an eyeball figure for lunch and smoke breaks, because on average that's how long it took. And I should add that everyone, including my bosses, used to log time similarly. The company had trusted us to not be dishonest with it, and it generally worked out fine. Anyway, that day on, I started using the timer for everything. 10-minute briefing? Going in the log. 5-minute company call? Logged. Start eating in 15 minutes instead of 30? Cut down smoke breaks from 2 to 1, among other things. Basically, I made sure almost every minute between my in and out times would be accounted for. They also maintained a timestamp of all the times someone enters and exits the office, which they combined with the log to check. I made sure I wasn't being dishonest in any way and just logging my actual work times. As you can guess, all the 11-hour overtime days piled up pretty quick, and at the end of the month I got called in by management again. My boss and his boss were both there. My boss was furious, demanding to know how my overtime hours had nearly doubled from previous months. I just said, I don't know, I'm using the timer just like I was instructed to. I told them to go through my in and out times, my breaks, my deliverables, and when the timer was started and stopped, to check if I was being dishonest or not. They sent me away after yelling at me a bit more, threatening termination if I was wrong. The next day, my boss told me to stop using the timer again and apologized for calling me dishonest. I stopped using it, but I told him that now I knew more accurately how long my stuff takes, I'll be logging accordingly even if I do so manually. In short, the company assumes I'm being dishonest with my time logging because of long working hours. Asks me to use an inbuilt timer which actually ends up showing more hours than I was logging before. Thanks to everyone who started a discussion about fair pay, ethics of working hours, and how to manage projects. I'd just like to add a couple of things because I don't think I made them clear. I don't work there anymore first of all, and I'm salaried. Hourly pay doesn't happen in these parts at all unless you're freelancing, sometimes not even then. The logging was more for getting leaves based on X amount of hours you put in over your usual time. Also, I found out later why they were this mad at me was because they knew after I'd tell people, everyone's leaves would go up and us being understaffed at the time, it wouldn't have been great for the company. Yep, sounds pretty typical. Get told by your boss to do things a certain way, get yelled at by his higher-ups for doing the way he told you to do it, switch to their way, get yelled at again. Good on you for claiming your due benefits from that point on. If they're going to drag you over the coals for stuff like this, I think it's probably a pretty good argument ender to show them just how much work you actually do for free. And I think most bosses at salaried work would be surprised at how much work some of their employees do that they don't think to count or charge for. All the phone calls outside of work hours and the extra minutes just tidying things up after the clock has struck 5 really do add up to quite a bit for those of you doing that sort of work. Turns out that making your staff aware exactly what they're due is something that these bosses ended up kicking themselves for. Don't get snotty at your employees for doing exactly what you told them to do, bosses. If you like Am I the Jerk, you're probably going to love Am I the Genius. Check it out, linked below. Also, go to amithejerk.com/submit if you would like to submit your own stories. Don't want to heed my warnings about giving deep discounts to wealthy clients? I work for a company that does commissions for clients. I'm the manager of my department. This comes with a number of responsibilities, and one of them is bidding on work. Last fall, I evaluated the current global situation and how it would be affecting the costs of our supplies and possible shortages, as well as inflation. As a result, I priced a few of our pieces of work to help prepare us for the price increases I'd predicted, giving us an 8 to 10% profit upon completion. A well-known client came in and contracted us to do a rather large and time-intensive project. This individual is very well off and is in no way in any danger of going broke anytime soon. However, they complained about the new prices. He'd contracted us in the past on certain items and wanted the same work done again, but seeing the new price, he complained to the boss and threatened to go elsewhere. The owner, my boss, decided I'd priced the work too high based on the complaints of this one customer. Previous customers hadn't batted an eye, by the way. The boss asks me to adjust the price down to be the same as the competition. Just so you know, the competition doesn't carry the same quality standards and often has 2 to 3 years of turnaround. I explained this to the boss that my numbers were based on the increases from suppliers and subcontractors who I speak to regularly. These companies we work with warned me beforehand about what was coming, and I took it all to heart. I'd passed the warning on to the new boss at the time, but it appeared he blew it off or forgot about it, and at the time of making the new price list, he didn't complain. It wasn't until this one, somewhat well-known client rose a stink that he decided to bring the issue up with me. So the boss insisted that we should be pricing lower to keep up with the competition, or else we'd lose the customer. Of course, I argued it would hurt us in the long run, and all we'd be doing is attracting tire kickers. He stood his ground though, and I didn't have the energy to fight him on it, so in the end, he's the boss and got what he wanted. So the time came to order the supplies and pay the subcontractors. The cost of these materials, as well as the work done on them, were 90% of the price boss had agreed to the customer. This is before my own labor costs were factored in. The boss sees the bill and gets really upset and asks me what the customer was paying to have the work done. I gently reminded him this was for a rich tire kicker customer, and I'd warned him well beforehand. But because he wanted to retain rich tire kicker customer, he got what he wanted. But the company did the work at cost, and perhaps more with my labor factored in. Boss later came to me and asked me to make up a new price list. I told him I didn't need to, I did that last fall, and as long as no one gives deep discounts, we'll be in the green. He's listening to me now. Thank frick. I was expecting the usual solution of them somehow blaming all of this on you despite all the warnings you gave him, and was mentally screaming at you to get his instructions in writing so that you could trace all of this to him if he tried to pull any funny business. But that wasn't necessary this time, unlike so many of our other stories. I don't know that I can name any jerks other than the rich client who didn't want to pay for quality work here. As they say in the trades, cheap, quick, and good. Pick two. It sounds like you guys were quick and good. That's gonna cost. If your client didn't like that, you could have let him try his luck with someone who charged a lower price and did a worse job. Lose out on one job instead of setting a precedent to let these cheapskates take advantage of you. Sincerely, a voice actor who in the past has done good work for way too little money and now knows his worth. Can't approve overtime? Okay, I'll just leave early on Friday. For background, this took place in the 1990s when a T1, which had a 1.5 megabit per second data connection, would run you over $500 a month. And only the phone companies and a few very large data-centric companies would ever dream of having a T3 with a connection speed of 43. I was working for one of those telephone companies in a central office where we provisioned and troubleshot those very lucrative services. There were 4 people in my department, making it one of the larger such offices in the States. One day there was one person on vacation and another one out of the office for some other reason. Tech number 3 called in sick, so I was alone for 8 hours with the workload of 4 technicians. Well, as a good employee, I prioritized and got all of the trouble tickets done and all of the most urgent new services installed. Everything due that day was done, but in the process I missed my 2 15-minute breaks and worked through lunch. My supervisor came down at the end of the day to congratulate me for my good work, and he was watching me fill out my timesheet for 9 hours. He started to get a little panicky and said he couldn't approve overtime. He'd get in trouble. I reminded him that I'd just spent 9 hours doing the work of 4 people, 32 hours worth of work. But he said it wasn't approved. I said, what can we do then? I worked it and I need to get paid. He suggested I leave an hour early on Friday, so I agreed. Come Friday, I decided to take full advantage and only have a half-hour lunch so I could leave at 3:30 instead of 4. Well, guess what? The vacationer and the sick person hadn't returned, so it was just 2 of us. The other person disappeared at 1:30 or so. I found out later she was interviewing for a management position. At 3 o'clock, I got paged for a ticket on one of those very expensive T3s going down hard. I was to join a conference bridge to assist in troubleshooting. I joined the call, and then at 3:25 I said, sorry, I have to drop off. I'm not approved for any overtime. The night shift person will be here in half an hour to help. I dropped off knowing the night person on duty had never worked on a T3 before. I hadn't even reached my car when the pager started blowing up. Overtime is approved. Please stay on. But I'd already clocked out, so I just smiled and got into my car. Drove home and took my wife out for a long overdue date night. The funny thing is, I really liked that manager. We were almost friends. We had a talk the following Monday where I told him he could trust I wouldn't cheat him, but he had to have my back. Well, at least you had rest assured that you'd be compensated appropriately in the days to come. I can't help but think he must have been in the other boss's sights after that. The idea of getting paid more for working more really shouldn't be as much of a taboo as it is to the workplaces we're hearing about today. And as we all know, it's only become more unacceptable to ask your due in the last 30 years. We'll see if we ever get to a point of appropriate compensation in your offices, people. Probably not without a revolution of some sort, though. Am I the jerk for telling my sister there's a reason her kids chose to live with their dad? I have a 14-year-old daughter, Jess. Her father and my husband died in an accident when she was young, so it's just been us two for a long time. As a result, we're very close and she's a lot more open to me than most kids are with their parents. Around a week ago, she asked if I could take her to the movies on a date with a guy in her class. I knew the guy distinctly because they've done some extracurriculars together, and I was thrilled he was my daughter's first boyfriend. I talked to him a few days ago, and they ended up just hanging out at our house for a bit afterwards. He was extremely polite, and maybe it's just the mum inside me, but I couldn't be happier for her. I went to my older sister's house for coffee earlier this morning. Backstory, my sister has two teenagers, aged 16 and 17, who live almost full-time with their dad. They had a very messy divorce around 3 years ago, and both kids chose to live with their dad. The reason for this was because my sister was extremely overbearing on them. She was the kind of mum who believed kids should have no privacy and she should run their lives until they were adults. I know she had many arguments with them because she'd take away their doors, not let them hang out with friends, and search through their phones every night. This was the primary reason for her divorce, although she won't admit that. While I love her, as someone who grew up with little privacy, I fully understand why her kids don't want to live with her. My daughter came up in conversation, so I brought up her first date. When I explained how it went, my sister laughed and told me that I must be joking. When she realized I was serious, she told me I was a terrible mother for letting my daughter walk all over me and not setting boundaries. She ranted on for a while, but she basically said that 14-year-olds are incapable of going out by themselves and that I was being lazy and neglectful by allowing her to do that. She also said, I would never allow my kids to do that. So I replied by saying, well, that's exactly why your kids live with their dad. She got very quiet and then told me to leave. When I got home, I started thinking more about what I said, and while at the time I thought I was simply telling her what she needed to hear, now I'm wondering if I crossed a line. Look, I feel for the pain your sister must be feeling at that revelation, but at the same time, the truth hurts. And you gave it to her after she went on an outrageous rant about what sounds like a very healthy parental relationship when it comes to you and your daughter's dating life. I wish more parents were as supportive and excited for their kids' dating lives as you are. I'm sure you set reasonable boundaries despite your sister's assertions. And it sounds like what she was doing to her kids wasn't setting boundaries, it was destroying their privacy and not letting them have any sort of freedom. And I'm sure that she's been confronted about her behavior before, so I'm sure this isn't even a revelation to her. Sadly, I don't think she'll learn anytime soon if she hasn't changed things thus far. Am I the jerk for filing a report against my late husband's colleague and getting him fired? My husband passed away 3 weeks ago. He used to work for this company for 4 years. He had known lots of people and made so many friends. For days, I kept getting texts from his colleague, Ted. I don't know him personally. I had no idea how he even got my number. When he first texted me, I texted, "Where did you get my number?" And he replied saying he got it from my husband. At first, I felt annoyed, but then I started getting flirty texts from him. They started getting more and more inappropriate. I warned him to stop, but then he sent me a D-pic one night at 3 a.m. and asked if I needed company. Since he knew I was lonely, I was appalled and enraged, and I couldn't even sleep that night. I waited till the early morning to go to the company, straight to his boss, and filed a report against him after explaining in detail about his behavior. He ended up getting fired because the other colleagues said he did me and my husband wrong and disrespected his memory. This guy started arguing about how low what I did was, coming to his work in hopes of ruining his livelihood. He kept saying it was between him and his workplace had nothing to do with it. But I've told him I've only known him as my husband's colleague, and he was his colleague. He and a friend of his said that I was aiming to get him fired and that he, quote, did nothing wrong, and that I could have talked it out with him instead. My mum called him a piece of crap for doing this to my husband and me, but also said he had a point in that I shouldn't have come after his livelihood, since the guy has a kid to provide for. I felt bad about the whole thing, and now I feel like I made things worse and acted out of emotions. No, screw that. This guy was harassing you after you told him you didn't want any communication of that sort. He got your information from his workplace and made his fateful communications to a former colleague's wife. I do feel bad for his kid, but maybe Ted should have thought about him before he started taking actions that impacted their welfare. I will admit that him getting fired was a surprise, but it's fairly common knowledge that sending this sort of unsolicited image can have consequences, especially if you attach your name to it. It could be nothing, or it could be the images being shared to your family. It could even be the person's friends and relatives coming around to beat the crap out of you. You know what, guys and girls? Just don't send these sort of things if you aren't 100% sure the recipient wants them. Then you don't have to spin the wheel of consequences with your life and livelihood. When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell to turn on notifications. Put the playlist on in the background to finish listening to all the stories. Or if you want to check out some great music, check out easymode.com. If you like Am I the Jerk, give Am I the Genius a shot. Everything linked in the description.
Börja spela in. Allt är på svenska. Det är ju jätteroligt. Ja.
Well, good evening, laddies, lasses and lasses, and welcome to The Click, the home of the only main character in the universe. That is right, and how do we prove that I am the only main character in the universe? I have a great idea. The trick is to debunk every other wannabe main character in the universe, and I will be the only one remaining.